A house divided. From that day on, Germany became a house divided. The conservatives would accept neither the Treaty of Peace nor the Republic which had ratified it. Nor in the long run would the army, General Gruner excepted, though it had sworn to support the new democratic regime and had itself made the final decision to sign at Versailles. Despite the November Revolution, the conservatives still held the economic power. They owned the industries, the large estates, and most of the country's capital. Their wealth could be used, and was, to subsidize political parties and a political press that would strive from now on to undermine the Republic. The army began to circumvent the military restrictions of the peace treaty before the ink on it was scarcely dry, and thanks to the timidity and short-sightedness of the socialist leaders, the officer corps managed not only to maintain the army in its old Prussian traditions, as we have seen, but to become the real center of political power in the new Germany. The army did not, until the last days of the short-lived Republic, stake its fortunes on any one political movement. But under General Hans von Zicht, the brilliant creator of the 100,000-man Reichswehr, the army, small as it was in numbers, became a state within a state, exerting an increasing influence on the nation's foreign and domestic policies, until a point was reached where the Republic's continued existence depended on the will of the officer corps. As a state within a state, it maintained its independence of the national government. Under the Weimar Constitution, the army could have been subordinated to the cabinet and parliament, as the military establishments of the other Western democracies were, but it was not. Nor was the officer corps purged of its monarchist, anti-republican frame of mind. A few socialist leaders, such as Scheidemann and Grzinski, urged democratizing the armed forces. They saw the danger of handing the army back to the officers of the old authoritarian imperialist tradition. But they were successfully opposed not only by the generals but by their fellow socialists, led by the Minister of Defense, Noske. This proletarian minister of the Republic openly boasted that he wanted to revive the proud soldier memories of the World War. The failure of the duly elected government to build a new army that would be faithful to its own democratic spirit and subordinate to the cabinet and the Reichstag was a fatal mistake for the Republic, as time would tell. The failure to clean out the judiciary was another. The administrators of the law became one of the centers of the counter-revolution, perverting justice for reactionary political ends. It is impossible to escape the conclusion, the historian Franz L. Neumann declared, that political justice is the blackest page in the life of the German Republic. After the Kapp Putsch in 1920, the government charged 705 persons with high treason. Only one, the police president of Berlin, received a sentence, 5 years of honorary confinement. When the state of Prussia withdrew his pension, the Supreme Court ordered it restored. A German court in December 1926 awarded General von Lüttwitz, the military leader of the Kapp Putsch, back payment of his pension to cover the period when he was a rebel against the government, and also the 5 years that he was a fugitive from justice in Hungary. Yet hundreds of German liberals were sentenced to long prison terms on charges of treason because they revealed or denounced in the press or by speech the army's constant violations of the Versailles Treaty. The treason laws were ruthlessly applied to the supporters of the Republic. Those on the right who tried to overthrow it, as Adolf Hitler was soon to learn, got off either free or with the lightest of sentences. Even the assassins, if they were of the right and their victims Democrats, were leniently treated by the courts, or, as often happened, helped to escape from the custody of the courts by army officers and right-wing extremists. And so the mild socialists, aided by the Democrats and the Catholic centrists, were left to carry on the Republic, which tottered from its birth. They bore the hatred, the abuse, and sometimes the bullets of their opponents, who grew in number and in resolve. In the heart of the people, cried Oswald Spengler, who had skyrocketed to fame with his book The Decline of the West, the Weimar Constitution is already doomed. Down in Bavaria, the young firebrand Adolf Hitler grasped the strength of the new nationalist, anti-democratic, anti-republican tide. He began to ride it. He was greatly aided by the course of events, two in particular, the fall of the mark and the French occupation of the Ruhr. The mark, as we have seen, had begun to slide in 1921, when it dropped to 75 to the dollar, The next year it fell to 400, and by the beginning of 1923 to 7,000. Already in the fall of 1922, the German government had asked the Allies to grant a moratorium on reparation payments. This the French government of Poincaré had bluntly refused. When Germany defaulted in deliveries of timber, the hard-headed French premier, who had been the wartime president of France, ordered French troops to occupy the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany, which, after the loss of Upper Silesia to Poland, furnished the Reich with 4/5 of its coal and steel production, was cut off from the rest of the country. This paralyzing blow to Germany's economy united the people momentarily as they had not been united since 1914. The workers of the Ruhr declared a general strike and received financial support from the government in Berlin, which called for a campaign of passive resistance. With the help of the army, sabotage and guerrilla warfare were organized. The French countered with arrests, deportations, and even death sentences, but not a wheel in the Ruhr turned. The strangulation of Germany's economy hastened the final plunge of the mark. On the occupation of the Ruhr in January 1923, it fell to 18,000 to the dollar. By July 1st, it had dropped to 160,000. By August 1st, to 1,000,000. By November, when Hitler thought his hour had struck, it took 4 billion marks to buy a dollar, and thereafter the figures became trillions. German currency had become utterly worthless. Purchasing power of salaries and wages was reduced to zero. The life savings of the middle classes and the working classes were wiped out. But something even more important was destroyed: the faith of the people in the economic structure of German society. What good were the standards and practices of such a society, which encouraged savings and investment and solemnly promised a safe return from them, and then defaulted? Was this not a fraud upon the people? And was not the democratic republic, which had surrendered to the enemy and accepted the burden of reparations, to blame for the disaster? Unfortunately for its survival, the republic did bear a responsibility. The inflation could have been halted by merely balancing the budget, a difficult but not impossible feat. Adequate taxation might have achieved this, but the new government did not dare to tax adequately. After all, the cost of the war, 164 billion marks, had been met not even in part by direct taxation, but 93 billions of it by war loans, 29 billions out of treasury bills, and the rest by increasing the issue of paper money. Instead of drastically raising taxes on those who could pay, the Republican government actually reduced them in 1921. From then on, goaded by the big industrialists and landlords, who stood to gain, though the masses of the people were financially ruined, the government deliberately let the mark tumble in order to free the state of its public debts, to escape from paying reparations, and to sabotage the French in the Ruhr. Moreover, the destruction of the currency enabled German heavy industry to wipe out its indebtedness by refunding its obligations in worthless marks. The General Staff, disguised as the Truppenamt, Office of Troops, to evade the peace treaty which supposedly had outlawed it, took notice that the fall of the mark wiped out the war debts, and thus left Germany financially unencumbered for a new war. The masses of the people, however, did not realize how much the industrial tycoons, the army, and the state were benefiting from the ruin of the currency. All they knew was that a large bank account could not buy a straggly bunch of carrots, a half-peck of potatoes, a few ounces of sugar, a pound of flour. They knew that as individuals they were bankrupt. And they knew hunger when it gnawed at them, as it did daily. In their misery and hopelessness, they made the Republic the scapegoat for all that had happened. Such times were heaven sent for Adolf Hitler. Revolt in Bavaria. The government calmly goes on printing these scraps of paper because, if it stopped, that would be the end of the government, he cried. Because once the printing presses stopped, and that is the prerequisite for the stabilization of the mark, the swindle would at once be brought to light. Believe me, our misery will increase. The scoundrel will get by. The reason, because the state itself has become the biggest swindler and crook. A robber's state. If the horrified people notice that they can starve on billions, they must arrive at this conclusion. We will no longer submit to a state which is built on the swindling idea of the majority. We want a dictatorship. No doubt the hardships and uncertainties of the wanton inflation were driving millions of Germans toward that conclusion, and Hitler was ready to lead them on. In fact, he had begun to believe that the chaotic conditions of 1923 had created an opportunity to overthrow the Republic which might not recur. But certain difficulties lay in his way if he were himself to lead the counter-revolution, and he was not much interested in it unless he was. In the first place, the Nazi Party, though it was growing daily in numbers, was far from being even the most important political movement in Bavaria, and outside that state it was unknown. How could such a small party overthrow the Republic? Hitler, who was not easily discouraged by odds against him, thought he saw a way. He might unite under his leadership all the anti-Republican nationalist forces in Bavaria. Then, with the support of the Bavarian government, the armed leagues and the Reichswehr stationed in Bavaria, he might lead a march on Berlin, as Mussolini had marched on Rome the year before, and bring the Weimar Republic down. Obviously, Mussolini's easy success had given him food for thought. The French occupation of the Ruhr, though it brought a renewal of German hatred for the traditional enemy and thus revived the spirit of nationalism, complicated Hitler's task. It began to unify the German people behind the Republican government in Berlin, which had chosen to defy France. This was the last thing Hitler wanted. His aim was to do away with the Republic. France could be taken care of after Germany had had its nationalist revolution and established a dictatorship. Against a strong current of public opinion, Hitler dared to take an unpopular line. No, not down with France, but down with the traitors of the fatherland. Down with the November criminals. That must be our slogan. All through the first months of 1923, Hitler dedicated himself to making the slogan effective. In February, due largely to the organizational talents of Röhm, 4 of the armed patriotic leagues of Bavaria joined with the Nazis to form the so-called Arbeitsgemeinschaft der Vaterländischen Kampfverbände, working union of the fatherland fighting leagues, under the political leadership of Hitler. In September, an even stronger group was established under the name of the Deutscher Kampfbund, German Fighting Union, with Hitler one of a triumvirate of leaders. This organization sprang from a great mass meeting held at Nuremberg on September 2nd to celebrate the anniversary of the German defeat of France at Sedan in 1870. Most of the fascist-minded groups in southern Germany were represented, and Hitler received something of an ovation after a violent speech against the national government. The objectives of the new Kampfbund were openly stated: overthrow of the Republic and the tearing up of the Treaty of Versailles. At the Nuremberg meeting, Hitler had stood in the reviewing stand next to General Ludendorff during a parade of the demonstrators. This was not by accident. For some time, the young Nazi chief had been cultivating the war hero, who had lent his famous name to the makers of the Putsch in Berlin, and who, since he continued to encourage counter-revolution from the right, might be tempted to back an action which was beginning to germinate in Hitler's mind. The old general had no political sense. Living now outside Munich, he did not disguise his contempt for Bavarians, for Crown Prince Ruprecht, the Bavarian pretender, and for the Catholic Church in this most Catholic of all states in Germany. All this Hitler knew, but it suited his purposes. He did not want Ludendorff as the political leader of the nationalist counter-revolution, a role which it was known the war hero was ambitious to assume. Hitler insisted on that role for himself. But Ludendorff's name, his renown in the officer corps and among the conservatives throughout Germany, would be an asset to a provincial politician still largely unknown outside Bavaria. Hitler began to include Ludendorff in his plans.